Welcome back, everybody, to my Malazan knitting class, or whatever this is going to be. Anyway, we're back with Gardens of the Moon, Book 3, The Mission, and of course we're going to check in with the knitting progress. It's getting longer, I think. We can clearly see this. I'm slightly happy with it. I guess another 2, 3 books, and you can actually begin to believe that it's going to be a scarf or something. We'll see. So this is what I wanted to show you first, before we get into the nitty-gritty of Book 3 of Gardens of the Moon, and I'll try to get to Book 4 today as well. We'll see how that works. So let's look into Book 3. Yeah, I have a new beer because I've run out of the boar beer, and my shop up here doesn't have any of it at the moment. So we're gonna go with Radeberger, which is a fairly popular big German brewery from Dresden. It is, yeah, it looks pretty cool. And it drinks, yeah, it's slightly more bitter than some of the other big brands in Germany, but it's still not, a actually very good beer. It's just a regular big brand beer. But my shop up here didn't have anything small, like from a really cool small brewery, so I took the best thing I could get today, I think. So yeah, cheers. All right. Okay, so let's start talking about Book 3, The Mission. We're back with the Malazans. We start out with the bridge burners landing outside of the Ruzhistan, and then relatively quickly, the largest part of Book 3 is taken up by happenings in Pale and beyond. There are some pretty big revelations in there, but once again, I don't want to, go into like the actual plot. Go read the damn book, okay? I'm trying to point out things that I recognize while reading it for the third time, and things that I think might be relevant to keep in mind for later on, because as many of you already know, this series is packed with stuff that is relevant all over the place and much later. And after the more lively, light-hearted prose of much of the Daruzhistan the chapters before, this time around we're once again in the more stately, linguistic, like stately pace, stately prose of the Malazan part. And we first see the taint of chaos. We learn a bit more about warrens. There's a lot of world building happening again here. We learn more about warrens. We learn more about gods, and I'm gonna go back into the gods business definitely in during this video. There's more in there about the gods situation in general. We learn more about the idea of chaos, there being elder warrens, that kind of thing. We see Hairlock getting more and more insane, driven insane by the chaotic power that twists him. We see all of that, and that's pretty cool. We learn more of, we get hints at Whiskey Jack's past. Keep that bird that steals thing in mind. It may become more relevant in later books. I'm not going to say more about that because I don't want to spoil anything, but just keep in mind that the Moranth call him bird that steals. That might be interesting. What else do we learn? We have a first large appearance of one of the main themes of the Malazan Book of the Fallen of the 10 main books, that comes up in a few very, very crucial scenes in Pale. The adjunct Lawn is coming to Pale, and we get more of the feeling of how the Empire under the Empress is dealing with the remainders, perceived loyalists of the Emperor, who is obviously dead at this point, at least perceived dead, stuff like that. We see more of that, and while this is mostly political intrigue, the point that stuck out for me and that I think is vital here, because it kind of goes into the main thing I wanted to say here, is how much people are driven by the roles that the overall situation forces on them. There is someone like Tayshran, the High Mage, who does tries to do a job that he's definitely not qualified to do. In a way, we have Dujak, the army commander, trying to do his thing. Like, you see human beings being forced into roles that history, in a way, and structures and forces like the empire require of them, and dealing with it in different ways. And there's this crucial scene in there when the adjunct is facing Tattersail, and we get this callback to the prologue where we learn that the adjunct was as a child in the mouse quarter of Malaz Island, and Tattersail was commanding the forces that led to that whole massacre and everything in the mouse quarter. And we have this incredibly emotional scene where the adjunct is confronting Tattersail on that, and Tattersail is bearing her guilt that came from dealing with that failed military operation. At the same time, though, we see that's like the twist in there is when the adjunct is reminded that the Empire needs Tattersail, and she, as the adjunct, has to push back or push down the motivations or the personality of the woman Lawn that she is. And Erickson puts this in like very clear and moving language when he says there has been an execution and the woman named Lawn ceased to exist. And yes, that's one of those big themes I mention all the time, is how the individual tries to keep or does not keep their humanity in the face of roles that are pushed upon the individual by history, by society, or by the structures that we as human beings are always embedded in. And we see in this situation, we see a very, very interesting, especially during that dinner with Tattersail, Dujak, and so forth. We see very different ways of dealing with that. We have the like almost humiliating, not humiliating him. We have the very, very emotional way that Tattersail deals with it, giving her humanity, her soul, her guilt, basically free reign, and using that to not attack, but to raising that above her role as a mage of the Malazan army. On the other hand, we have the adjunct who actually pushes down or denies the existence of her human side in favor of her role as the adjunct. The adjunct is already like this super impersonal name. Like when you think about it, the adjunct, it's very impersonal. It basically objectifies her, makes her just to another cog in the wheel. And that's something that is mentioned again and again also in this chapter, or was it already in this book, or was it already in book 1? I keep forgetting. I think it's book 3, where it's all about the fact that all these people are just small cogs in the large Malazan arm like machine, and don't know exactly the roles they have to play, and try to play those roles to the best of their ability. So we have, on the one hand, we have Tattersail almost denying or pushing away her role in the Malazan machine in favor of her humanity, of her emotional, personal side, her humanity. I want to call it humanity. I think that's the best way to say. On the other hand, we have the adjunct denying her humanity completely in favor of her role as the adjunct. And then in the middle of that, we have Dujak, one arm, who is also someone who tries to keep his humanity and fulfill his role as as a large wheel in the Malazan machine, and the machine of the Empire. We have all those three people in this one scene We have both extremes, and we have the compromise. And in the end, what how it looks for me is that the hardest part, or the one who probably suffers most in the end, is Dujak, because keeping those two forces in constant balance and constant strife takes a large toll takes a large toll of him. And there is something liberating in what Tattersail does when she actually offers her life and bears her guilt toward the adjunct. And there's also something liberating in a way in denying your humanity, like Lon does in that scene. And that's one of those scenes that make Malazan so powerful. And yeah, and something that will come up again and again and again in this book and in further books, the idea of how to balance out those demands, outside demands and inside demands, how to keep your humanity in the face of these forces, which is always a bit of a rebellion to keep your humanity in, because the demands of history, the demands of the machine are large and powerful. Like, going against that, or at least striving really hard to keep those two things in balance, is a very difficult charge. It's one of those things that makes being human so difficult sometimes. The next big thing that is kind of interesting is also in this book, gods. We need to talk about gods. I love talking about gods, and with something that is interesting here is we learn a lot about the way, like, we learn a lot about how the Malazan mindset, or the general mindset in this world towards gods, is. And that's something that is interesting. Now, for someone who comes, even though he's not a very, even though I'm not a believer, I obviously come from a Christian Catholic, actually a Roman Catholic, but from a Christian background, in the way that, like, the culture I grew up. And something that is fundamentally different in the Malazan world from a monotheist, in a modern monotheist sense, be it Muslim, be it Islam, or be it Christianity, mostly. Judaism is different from all I know, but I'm not an expert on the Old Testament. I just read a lot. I will not go into too much detail there, but the one big thing is that the God of Christianity, like the monotheist God, is a creator being that is outside the creation. It's outside of the universe, which makes interacting with that creator very, very difficult. It's depending, but I don't want to go too deeply into theology here. The gods in the Malazan world, as gods in classical Greek, or Greco-Roman, or even like Nordic mythology, or the Finnish one, if you look at that, compared to that, are inside the cosmos, and you can interact with them on a very, very different level. They are inside the cosmos. The Malazan gods are also inside the cosmos. You can declare a god an enemy of the Malazan Empire, as Opon is declared an enemy of the Empire in book 3. You can interact with those beings. That's where we come to gods within the Malazan universe right now. From what we see up to this point, are basically just very, very, very powerful beings, but they are in the same category. That the power level might be extremely different, but they are fundamentally of the same class. They are maybe immortal, but as we learned in book 2, they can still be killed, so they're not actually really immortal. They're just extremely long-lived until something ends their existence in a rather brutal way. But generally the same rules, the same fundamental rules apply to gods and as well as men, and that's something we need to keep in mind when we come to the interactions between humans and gods within the Malazan world. as I said, it's similar to how gods interact in Greco-Roman mythology, in Nordic mythology, in the the whole Finnish mythology, and all like basically all the other mythologies I know enough about to talk about. It's like but it's just fundamentally different from how Christian theology or is like Muslim theology works, as far as I know. As I said, the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament, is also still very much active inside the inside creation, and as I said, it's important to keep this in mind when looking at gods and how gods behave. It gives leverage. It gives leverage to humanity, or in this case, first of all, the Malazan Empire. It gives them leverage against divine beings, against gods. On the other hand, it also makes gods vulnerable and afraid. An all-powerful monotheist god doesn't have to be afraid of a human empire. It just doesn't bother with that kind of thing. But since we have those basically just superhero, superhuman beings, ascendants, if you will, their concerns are still understandable. Now, this is obviously makes a lot of things easier for us as readers and for Stephen Erickson as a writer, because motives and all of that are fundamentally understandable and thus describable. Whereas if you look at a other like this other kind of divine being, it gets very, very difficult to ascribe motives to something like that. And this is something that we will definitely come back to when I actually start talking about someone like Anomander Rake, which I kind of forgot to talk about in book 2, and I'll keep it until book 4, I think, when he shows up again and we have more time to actually talk about Anomander Rake. So what did I want to say? Yeah, the first big thing I wanted to talk about book 3 is the first big, not climax, but the first big scene in which the one of those main Malazan themes of the individual humanity in the face of overarching outside demands comes to a heat. It comes to a head. We have that big dinner with Tattersail, the adjunct, and Dujak. And the other thing is that we learn more about the roles of gods within the Malazan universe. We also learn more about about how magic works. We learn more about the Warrens. Those are also very interesting points. Another thing that really I found very interesting and something I think is vital to keep in mind, make a note about it when we come to something in House of Chains and beyond. So I'm not going to spoiler anything. I'm just going to say, keep in mind how Baladan Skullcrusher thinks and acts. There's this also already, like earlier on in book 1, this one beginning quote from Gotha's Folly on the Thelaman Tublikai. Keep that in mind. The scene at the end of, not at the end of book 3, near the end of book 3, with when Tattersail meets him again, that is just like a very, very emotional scene for me. It's just very sad, because it's once again a moment where personal convictions have are being brought to their logical conclusion. Baladan doesn't want to do what he has to do. He does it anyway because it's so ingrained in his belief and his personality in a way, and that's just something that I find very, very sad indeed, very moving in a way. I'm not a very principled person. I have a lot of respect for people who can be that principled in a way. But there's obviously a danger in that, in being such a strict, principled individual. That's definitely something to also keep in mind for later on, as I already said. What else was interesting about book 3? Let me have a think. Well, um, yeah, we get shown more people, and we get to see that there's also some conflicts the um, within the opposition of the Malazan Empire. We get to see a bit of Kaladin Brood for the first time. We get to meet Kalor for the first time. There's interesting stuff in there. Just keep those scenes in mind for later on, because they first establish our first views of certain important characters. One other thing is Crone has some more appearances as a Raven. Um, have you noticed how similar Crone's speech patterns are sometimes to Krappa's speech patterns? In a way, that's something to keep in mind also for later on, in case those two ever meet. And just, I guess that more or less covers my thoughts on book three. As I said, there's a lot of development going on, but not so much like a lot of action that didn't, that doesn't stick out much. It's interesting action. We have big magics once again, some troubling implications for the future, but it still lays a lot of groundwork apart from this one big for me scene in the at this dinner. That's the one that really hit hard for me. Yeah, I guess that's it for book three. I guess it's a bit shorter than the other ones. We'll see what I have to say about book four in a while. I'll go back to knitting and reading because that's all I can do right now, because it's a Saturday and shops are closed and we have a lockdown and all of these things. So I'll see you rather soonish, I think. Until then, cheers.